Hey everyone, I'm Dave and this is Mass Effect running at 1080p 60 frames per second with max settings enabled. It's really the ultimate way to play the game. It gives you a level of smoothness and controller response that simply isn't possible on consoles, and of course you get a ton of visual upgrades as well. However, achieving 1080p 60 fully maxed out is incredibly difficult. It requires an high-end GPU. In this case we're using the GTX 1080 Ti, and that's simply not cheap. Most gamers are likely to be using more modest graphics hardware. In this case, the GTX 1060 and Radeon RX 480 are kind of the sweet spot for hitting 1080p 60 with maxed out settings in a lot of games. So we wanted to see how Mass Effect Andromeda holds up and what kind of visual experience you can get while targeting 1080p 60. The idea is to get console settings all better while getting a 60 FPS experience. We'll start with the GTX 1060, and yeah, it's clear that ultra settings are completely off the cards here. We're basically getting anything between 40 to 50 FPS in terms of the general experience, and it falls well short of the 60 FPS target we want. It's just not consistent enough to be a viable alternative for 1080p 60. However, if we look at the high preset, that does a much better job, and in fact most of the time the GPU has enough headroom to deliver 60 frames per second across extended runs of gameplay. But it's not quite perfect, and as you probably noticed there are pockets of frame rate drops which have the engine go below 60 FPS, where the engine is more heavily stressed. Now, it's worth saying that these drops in performance don't occur all that often, but we find that the experience isn't really solid enough for hardcore PC gamers that want a definitive 1080p 60 experience, and settings will need to be lowered in order to accomplish this. Here we're running the GTX 1060 again, this time with the high preset on the left and our custom settings on the right. And here what we've done is lowered shadow quality, mesh quality, terrain quality and vegetation quality down from high to medium. And indeed this gives us slightly more headroom, enough headroom to maintain a mostly solid 60 FPS through an entire run of play. The difference here is those occasional small stutters that weren't really that perceivable before are now pretty much eliminated, giving us a 60 FPS lock exactly when we want it. The only area where we can't achieve 1080p 60 is the cutscenes. There are frequent stutters in between cutscene transitions which impact the frame rate, and this happens whichever sort of setup you tend to use. So unfortunately you will have to sacrifice some movements during the cinematics, but in gameplay a solid 60 FPS is definitely attainable. That's the GTX 1060, but what about the RX 480? Well, the results are a little more interesting. Usually when it comes to Frostbite titles, AMD cards generally have a frame rate advantage, but not in this case. Performance is actually slightly slower than the GTX 1060, and you will need to reduce slightly more settings in order to get a 60 FPS experience. Clearly when comparing high to ultra, ultra again is off the cards. And the high preset here, well, it's struggling more than the GTX 1060. There's more frequent frame rate drops below 60 FPS, and that means the experience isn't quite as smooth. And those little stutters, well, they do become visible during gameplay. It's not a bad experience. I mean, the game does run at 60 FPS for extended periods, but at the same time, it doesn't give us the 1080p 60 lock we really want. It's not too far behind, but I feel that for those that really want ultra smooth frame rates, it perhaps doesn't quite cut it. Moving over to high settings versus our custom settings, and it's clear that with a few tweaks it's possible to get enough headroom to maintain 60 FPS for the majority of the time, and that's with console quality settings. In fact, it's worth mentioning that on both cards, reducing certain settings to medium still gives you PS4 level graphical quality, but with better frame rates. So you're not actually getting a worse visual experience than consoles here. In fact, it is a lot better considering you're not very far off from hitting 60 frames per second. So if we look here, we're getting up to around an additional 10 frames per second when using custom settings on the RX 480. Like with the GTX 1060, we're running with shadow quality, mesh quality, terrain quality and vegetation quality set to medium, and for the most part it does a very good job at giving us the headroom to hit 60 frames per second. It's almost perfect but not quite, and in areas where the engine is more heavily taxed, then frame rates do drop slightly below the 60 FPS mark, so it's not quite as smooth in those moments. In order to get around this, you'll need to reduce settings such as HBAO down to SSAO and reduce effects quality down one notch from high. This does mean that we're not quite matching the PS4 Pro version in all areas. Ambient occlusion, for example, drops down a notch below that particular platform, but it will get you a better lock at 60 FPS. And if steady frame rates are really important to you, then I'd suggest that's probably the way to go. But ultimately these same settings we used across both cards work very well, and to be honest, I don't think drops of 2 to 5 FPS in the most demanding scenes are really that bad. There's certainly nothing to complain about. As you probably noticed, the majority of the time we've got enough headroom to hit 60 FPS perfectly. Okay, so that's the individual cards tested, but what does it look like when we put them side by side, both using the same custom settings? Well, pretty good actually. There are moments when both cards perform to roughly the same level and have enough headroom to give us 60 FPS. In fact, both cards do deliver a 1080p 60 experience for the most part. However, it's worth noting that in terms of headroom, the ability to keep delivering 60 FPS in demanding moments, the GTX 1060 does have a small lead here. So if frame rates were to say to drop down to 57 FPS on the AMD card, the Nvidia card would have enough GPU grunt just to keep us at that 60 FPS line. It's not always a major difference, but ultimately it means you're more likely to get a 1080p 60 lock on the GTX 1060 without needing to reduce settings any further. Either way though, I have to say performance is still excellent with both of these cards, and while the GTX 1060 does give you slightly more stable frame rates under load in demanding scenes, both cards are good enough to give you a 1080p 60 experience for say 99% of the time, and the occasional drops don't happen very often, and it's not something I would really worry about. It's really only the cutscenes that cause us a few problems here, and this is one area where we can't quite get a 60 FPS lock. Those stutters between transitions mean frame rates are often variable, going up to 70 to 80 FPS, sometimes even 100 FPS before falling down to 50 FPS levels. But aside from cutscenes, the gameplay, perhaps the most important part, is relatively solid, and we can achieve a nice 1080p 60 experience there on both cards. Anyway, with that said, I think that about covers everything. So if you found this video useful, don't forget to give us a like or subscribe, and also check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, where you can download the original high quality source file. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.